My name is Lianne Philipsen. I'm Director of Climate Change with SQ Consult, and we are supporting the Partnership for Market Readiness in their activities on the topic of today's session, which is beyond the price tag, calibrating carbon pricing instruments into the national climate policy mix. Title chosen to indicate that the impact of carbon pricing instruments is not just the carbon price, but also how it interacts with other policy instruments that are implemented in a national policy mix. We'll have two short presentations in this session, followed by a panel. Some central questions, but we also hope to get questions from you, so please take note if some questions come up during the first part of our session, and hopefully we have time to sufficiently discuss them in the second half of our session. Okay, it worked before. Now it doesn't. Yeah, here we go. As you know, carbon pricing instruments are not implemented in a vacuum. Countries have a range of policy instruments that they have implemented that contribute directly or indirectly to emission reductions. And once carbon pricing instruments are introduced into that policy mix, there can be interactions occurring. Both types of policy instruments can impact each other. That impact depends on the type of policy instruments, the type of carbon pricing instruments that you implement, but also the type of other climate policy instruments that are in place and their design. And that determines the effectiveness of both the CPIs themselves, but also the whole climate policy mix in the country. So understanding how these type of policy interactions work is really important to ensure that carbon pricing instruments are designed, calibrated towards this national policy mix to make sure that they optimally contribute to the overall impact on emissions and achieving the country's policy objectives. The Partnership for Market Readiness, market implementation is developing guidance on this to support policymakers in this process. And we're actively looking for feedback on that. This session is one part of that feedback, but there will also be other occasions. Maybe to mention, the main focus of this guidance will be on emissions trading and carbon taxes, though of course many of these instruments are also linked to crediting mechanisms. Now, if we talk about policy interactions, these impacts can be positive or negative. And what do we mean with that? Positive impacts we define as instruments reinforcing each other, strengthening each other, so that the overall impact on emission reductions is larger than you would have in case of a standalone instrument. Conversely, negative impacts would be if the instruments work against each other, thereby reducing the emission reductions that you would expect from summing the impacts of the standalone instruments. Two examples of that last case, as you can imagine, if you implement measures, for instance, to stimulate renewable electricity generation, emissions in the power sectors go down, but if that sector is also part of an emissions trading, you create room for emissions in other sectors. The waterbed effect that you probably will have heard of. Another route through which these type of interactions can take place is, for instance, if you have policies that limit the consumption of fossil fuels, for instance, energy efficiency standards, that might impact the consumption of those fuels, thereby, if the scale is large enough, impacting fuel prices. That can partly counteract the impact that you'd want to have by putting a carbon price on those fuels and thereby reducing the overall impact on emission reductions. In the work that we've done to support the PMI, we have really tried to look at empirical evidence and practical experience. So we conducted survey among policymakers, interviews, and also a number of case studies, in-depth case studies, where we tried to look at different types of countries with longer experience with carbon pricing instruments, or countries that have started more recently, partly still developing their policies in PMI countries in question, but also different types of CPIs, different types of other climate policy instruments. And I won't go into detail in this, but just to mention a few examples. The Netherlands was covered as one of the countries with a longer history, part of the EU emissions trading system, of course. Interesting aspect here is that the EU ETS is governed at an EU level, but of course, as a country, the Netherlands also has national policy instruments. At the EU level, policy proposals for the ETS always have to be accompanied by an impact assessment, which looks at all the feedback loops and impacts on fuel prices, the impacts of existing renewable energy efficiency policies, etc. And that, for instance, is then used to determine the cap in the EU ETS. So in that respect, a lot of those potential interactions are taken into account. So here it's especially relevant for national policies that are implemented after the cap for the ETS has been set. Also because the Netherlands cannot change unilaterally those rules for the EU ETS. And for instance, one thing that the Netherlands did was implement a coal phase-out or a ban on coal consumption in the power sector with a given cap on the emissions already in the EU ETS set. So potentially that could have led to substantial waterbed effect if it were not for the case that by that time Europe had implemented the market stability reserve as a mechanism to take out excess of allowances of the market. One other example, if I go to China, of course China has its national ETS. They also have a recently updated renewable energy portfolio standards as well as a green certificate scheme. And they also restarted their domestic crediting mechanism. Discussions in China are still going on how exactly the rules will be about eligibility in terms of is there overlap, because China in principle also intends to include indirect emissions in its ETS, the emissions from purchased heat and electricity. So there the question is how that at all impacts each other. Basically, a message of this slide is that these different national contexts, different types of CPIs, different types of other climate policy instruments, also the order in which they are implemented and their design all determines how big interactions can be and also what kind of solutions you can think of minimizing potential negative impacts. Some important lessons so far, and the work is still ongoing, is that countries do intentionally combine overlapping CPIs in a climate policy mix to strengthen the impact of the entire policy mix and to deliver on desired outcomes. And the latter can also include more than just emission reductions. These potential policy interactions are generally on policymakers' radar, but the extent to which they are taken into account structurally in policy design and evaluation differs by countries. And we have also received feedback from countries saying, well, lack of resources is really preventing us from doing this more structurally. What's important also is that different policy instruments often have different institutional responsibilities, potentially also legislative frameworks related to those instruments that can conflict. And of course, there are different vested interests of the people who have been working on those policies in the past. And all of that can lead to a reduced effectiveness of the overall policy mix. But on the positive side, there are design choices for carbon pricing instruments as well as other policies that can help some of these limit some of these negative policy interactions. Last slide, and let me emphasize that this is work in progress. Some potentially helpful steps in what we call calibration of carbon pricing instruments towards this policy mix is one to start with a mapping of existing policy instruments that reduce directly or indirect emissions, including their objectives, their barriers, and to identify potential interactions of those policies with carbon pricing instruments. Also looking at the mechanism through which these impacts can occur. So does it affect emissions directly or prices directly or indirectly? What kind of drivers does it affect, and how does it ultimately affect emissions, and how does it link to the carbon pricing instruments? Important to assess where possible the impact of those potential policy interactions at the time of design, ideally with economic modeling that helps you identify the impacts on, for instance, fuel prices and how that affects these interactions. Linking back to an earlier session today, it's important also to consider the political economy environment in this regard, also related to the readiness of the country to implement carbon pricing instruments and the need for capacity building. And something that was also mentioned there in one of the panels is that it's really important to engage stakeholders early on in the design process. So not just when the policy is announced and information is shared, but really taking into account their expertise, their experience, and also their political interest in the design phase to ensure that the design ultimately is more effective. And then I mentioned including some of these design elements that can help limit the negative impacts. What you see here, most of them are related to ETS, but you can also think about sector coverage, timing for carbon taxes, etc. We're very much looking for further suggestions. If we're limited in time, we're probably going to be limited in time. I will be around a little bit after this meeting also to further exchange with you or to exchange contact details in case you want to provide further input for while we're working further on this guidance within this project. With that, I have taken too much time as a moderator. That's not a good thing. I will introduce the panel while I'll pass this on. We can go to the next presentation now. With me, we're very happy to welcome our panel. We have, let's start in the middle because that's how I have my notes here. Charlene Hamreich, she's the Director for Environmental and Fuel Taxes at the National Treasury in South Africa. And she has 15 years of experience in designing and implementing carbon tax policies and also environmental tax reform. Next to me here we have Jiben Chen, who is Senior Carbon Market Expert at ICAP, where he focuses on the cooperation between the EU and China on ETS as well as ETS developments in the Asia-Pacific region. Before that, he was based in Beijing, where he supported the Chinese government in developing and implementing the national and pilot ETS systems. And then Rodrigo Pizarro from OECD, where he's a senior climate economist and the head of the International Program Action on Climate, IPAC. Previously, before that, he was head of the Environmental Economics Division of the Ministry of Environment in Chile, where he was responsible for the development and implementation of the Chilean carbon tax. And from his work at OECD, Rodrigo has some interesting insights to share with us on policy mixes and how countries work with that. So the floor is yours, Rodrigo.
Thank you very much. So sorry for a second presentation with a few slides. I'll be hopefully very brief, but I do want to show you some data that we've developed at the OECD, which is pertinent to the work that Diane presented. The World Bank has done wonderful work in systematizing information on carbon pricing in general. The state and trends of carbon pricing is a key publication. However, unfortunately, we lack a lot of information on other types of policy instruments, and in particular non-market-based policy instruments. So the OECD has developed a comprehensive data set on non-market and market-based policy instruments in order to follow up and assess how these different policy interactions and how climate mitigation approaches are evolving across the world. I'm not going to go into detail in the database. It's available on our webpage. We have assessed this for 50 countries, and we're interested in expanding. So I'm just going to mention a few highlights and key points that can be derived or analyzed based on this data. The first thing you see here is a diagram on the evolution of policy instruments. Now, you see here there's a typology of policy instruments, and we have here what we call market-based, non-market-based, and targets, governance, and climate data. Now, interestingly, in the last, 12 years, we can go back until 1990. What we are seeing is actually quite slow progress-based policy instruments. And we're seeing a lot of progress on non-market-based policy instruments and target and governance approaches. So this explains different approaches and different sort of policy landscapes that countries are implementing in order to deal with their climate policies. Now, in order to explain this a little bit, I think it's important to understand the database. And what we have here is the growth in general in climate action. Climate action, we define it in terms of two different concepts. One is policy adoption, and the other one is policy stringency, which is a key concept which is very difficult to assess when you're not dealing with carbon pricing, but you're dealing with non-market-based policy instruments. And what we're seeing is a plateau of the adoption of climate policies across the world. Climate policies adoption actually is stalling and it's slowing down. However, in recent years, also what we're seeing is that there is some increase in policy stringency across the world, and there are specific countries that example of that. As you see this evolution, it helps us track how countries are implementing their climate policies, but also it allows us to assess countries in terms of their specific landscape policies. This was a report, a working paper by the OECD from the economics department using this data. And what it does is, with a machine learning approach, it identifies different policy approaches to climate mitigation. And you'll see here that these different strategies that are presented, which are, they use a kind of a minimum squares approach to compare and contrast the policies across these different countries. And what you see is that there are different policy strategies across different countries. And I think this is critical in order to think about carbon pricing as we go ahead, because carbon pricing or different policy approaches must be considered in the context of these different strategies or these different policy landscapes. We divided this into 4 strategic groups, and you'll see that these are different countries. I'm sorry you can't see it very well. Again, this paper is available, but I think it's incredibly important as we go ahead and understand and appreciate climate mitigation policies that we do so in the context of understanding how these policy landscapes or these policy approaches, the broader policy approaches, are being implemented in countries. These policy approaches obviously are related to institutional frameworks, historic approaches, and so forth. So we must understand that implication, those implications in the context of carbon pricing. And I'm sure my colleagues here who have experience in individual countries understand how they have to adjust these policies in the context of their historical policies. Another policy another study which was recently released a couple of weeks ago by Science, I know you cannot see this, is a very interesting study also using our data. And what this study does, it uses again a machine learning approach to identify emission breaks across developing and developed countries. It uses more than 50 countries. Here you see, you have an image, if you will, of these different countries. I'll show you this in more detail. And we detected what we defined as 63 emission breaks across the world. And the question here was, what explains those emissions breaks? What kind of policy mixes? Yesterday we heard colleagues from the UK. This is an example from the UK's electricity sector. There's a lot of study on the significant emission break that occurred in the UK in the mid-2010s to 2020s. And there's a lot of studies on this, and it has been often attributed to carbon pricing. But it's only because carbon pricing is the information that's out there. And as the colleague from the UK mentioned, there is a number of policy mixes that can also support and explain this emission break. And here underneath there you see in bars the data from our database that shows you that, the emission break that's observed in this period is accompanied by a number of different types of policies and policy instruments. So the ability of identifying the type of policy mixes that are complementing and supporting carbon pricing, I think, is one of the key research areas as we move ahead. This study, you'll see it in Science. It's a very interesting study. It's a different approach. And what it's done there, it's combined. I know you can't see that very well, but it's trying to assess for developing and developed countries the different policy approaches that are being implemented across the world, and explain those 63 emission breaks, which are significant reductions in a time period. I'll just finish with just a few very key messages because of time. Once again, 63 emissions breaks were identified. We tried to explain this and assess it in terms of the different policy mixes. And one of the conclusions, not surprisingly, is that there is no one-size-fits policy. There is a number of policy approaches that have been implemented, and that can be assessed in terms of carbon pricing. Also, I think it's important, the third message is in which it seems that policy mixes are more effective than standalone policies. Again, that's something to confirm and to generate some detail. And again, with respect to carbon pricing, there are a number of conclusions which I think might be of interest. Carbon pricing works better in developed countries. This is not surprising. But pricing, because of both the policy landscape, the combination of policy instruments, and obviously that it's easier to have profit maximizing firms and a high share of private consumers. So these are key studies that emerged from this policy database. It's called the Climate Action Measurement Framework, and hopefully it's something that will contribute to your assessment and analysis, and to draw on these types of studies that can help you support not only assessing policy mixes and climate mitigation approaches, but also how to improve carbon pricing effectiveness results in the context of these different policy landscapes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. That was very interesting to see what you can do with such a broad data set of countries. And it was also interesting to hear about the break in emissions and how they link chronologically with policies. I mean, that's one challenge that we've had. And if you look ex post at emission developments and carbon price developments, it's very tricky to allocate what causes which development, so of individual policies already, let alone policy interactions. Let me go to the other panelists with some questions. I'll come back to you, Rodrigo, in a bit. First, I have a question for both Charlene and Jibin, a more general question. And that is from your perspective, what role do you see carbon pricing instruments having in a broader climate policy mix? And to which extent would you foresee how they impact this broader policy mix in terms of interactions, combinations, etc.? Charlene, do you want to go first?
I will. Thank you very much for that question, and I'm understanding some of the conclusions that came out of the work that the OECD has done, and it's quite interesting here. Look, I think broadly we've been very clear around climate change is a global externality issue, and it's a question of, from an economics perspective, how you can start to internalize those costs into the price structures. And some of the benefits of looking at market-based instruments is that we are in a situation where we have a target of 1.5 degrees to meet sort of in the, up to 2050 or so. We've made commitments to meet that, but there are those uncertainties around how do we get there. And carbon pricing does provide that flexibility at a company firm level in terms of how companies respond to price signals and make the necessary investments to transition and shift to alternatives. As the climate change becomes urgent, and we say it's very urgent right now, the role for command and control instruments starts to get more important. And I think that's what we've seen with the emissions break or structural break in the data around the uptake of regulatory measures, especially after COP15, it was in Copenhagen, which failed quite badly. And I think there was more of a political commitment around this. So carbon pricing definitely has a role in the context of the broader climate policy mix. The issue is around, can we price the externality at the level that is required in order to achieve those emission reductions. And right now, I don't think we can price it on the upper end of 100 to 200 to 1,000 US dollars per ton. So it's a question around taking a phased approach towards getting the price signals in, strengthening those over time, and trying to crowd in the private sector investment that is needed in lower carbon technologies to actually facilitate that transition. So I think this applies in the context of developing economies as well, and how you price carbon, whether it's through a tax, whether it's through an emissions trading scheme, and I'm assuming you'll have carbon crediting schemes that form part of tax and emission trading schemes. Within that, I think that depends on the country's circumstances there. I just want to pick up on the point around how effective a carbon price would be in a developing country context, and maybe it's broader than that, in terms of the market structure that we have, especially for the power sector. In the South African experience, we have a situation of a historic monopoly when it comes to electricity generation. We found ourselves with challenges in the 2000s and up to now in terms of electricity supply, given the structure of the market. And we've recently, our president recently approved amendments to our Electricity Regulation Act that provides for competition in the generation sector. So the market shifts, and as that market is shifting, the role for carbon pricing can become bigger and correct those economic incentives within the structures. And then within that, we have a strong shift towards renewable energy. It is in the context of achieving our climate goals, but it played a bigger role because we had a situation of power outages, lack of electricity supply, and then we had the private sector and households that started to shift to solar PV, rooftop PV, in order to supplement the electricity generation. So it's a combination of the climate goals and the need for energy security that forced that shift. So broadly, yes, the instrument has a role. I agree that as we move forward, there will need to be more studies around the interaction and the role that market-based instruments play, and regulatory measures could shift in the next 5-10 years, and we could come back to that. But what's important is to have that pricing signal in on the margin as a punitive measure, and build in the appropriate regulatory measures, performance standards, emission intensity benchmarks that can also help that transition. And then very lastly, just in the South African experience, in terms of the carbon tax, we introduced this tax in June 2019. We already had in place a proxy carbon tax through an electricity generation levy that was implemented in 2009. And then we also implemented a program for renewable energy independent power producers around 2012 or 2013. So when it came to the carbon tax coming into effect in 2019, there was good comments from our stakeholders around concerns in terms of double taxation, industry competitiveness, impacts on households due to higher energy prices. So we provided a concession within the design of the tax to say that, any payments of the electricity levy and any purchases of renewable electricity through the IPP program can be offset against the carbon tax liability of electricity generators. And that would be in place up until 2025. And we're in a process now to look at the future of some of these concessions and allowances to strengthen the price signal. I'll stop there, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Charlene. It provides me a hook for my next question to you, but let's first go to Jubin and talk from the Chinese perspective on this question.
Yes, thanks for the question, and thanks for the invitation to this panel. I agree what the three of you already mentioned. So carbon pricing has its own advantage to internalize the damage of carbon, of GHG, and it also give the price signal to the traditional fossil fuel and let the new technology, new low carbon technology become relatively cheaper and engage and encourage people to consume more. That's already been approved in EU and in California, in a lot of ETS. And from China, I would say China learned this whole concept since the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism time, and it also gave a great incentive to the Chinese company, Chinese stakeholders to build up the renewable energy industry at the time. But now, I would say the different country has its own situation, different economic situation, industrial background, policy background, different NDCs. So ETS will play different role at a different stage of different jurisdictions. We talk about EU ETS. It plays it's a backstone of the whole EU policy, but in China, it's more like right now is raising the awareness from the companies, and it encouraged the companies to build up the expectation that in the future they need to pay more. So right now, for the power sectors, 60-70 of the power groups in China, they already have their internal carbon management team. And the China ETS started to trade in 2021, and after that, the intensity of fossil fuel plants decreased around 3%. So it already triggered a very positive effect. But now it's still not, it doesn't have a clear link to the NDC. Right now, well, because of also the China NDC is based on intensity per GDP. It commit to peak around or before 2030, but it doesn't have a absolute cap in China's NDC. So there's still not direct link between the ETS goal and the NDC goal. But I think as long as China getting closer to the peak and the China ETS evolves, and you will build up a stronger link to see how China ETS can contribute to achieve NDC. So the China use all other kind of policies, such as subsidies to the renewable energy and the electric vehicle, and also a lot of because a lot of industry are controlled or mostly dominated by state-owned companies. So a lot of command and control policy, like close the small plants and build up big plants to increase the efficiency. That kind of command and control policy and subsidy and also environment tax, not carbon tax, but environment tax is also helping the industry to become greener. So in different phases, the ETS will play different role, and I have the confidence that the ETS in China will play a bigger role. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Very good insights, Jimin. And I think indeed the link to NDCs is very important, but also it's a process over time that every country will go through at its own pace. Looking at the time, some two country-specific questions to both Charlene and Jimin, maybe with a relatively concise answer before we go to Rodrigo again, and then hopefully to the floor as well. Charlene, you mentioned already the relation between carbon pricing instruments and command and control policies. And in that respect, South Africa is, of course, very interesting because you have the carbon tax, and now you're developing the mandatory sectoral and company-level carbon budgets. Can you say something about to which extent you foresee challenges in combining them, and if so, how South Africa is thinking of dealing with that?
Thanks, Diane. The biggest challenge was that this proposal for carbon budgets came through in the middle of the consultations on the carbon tax. So there were a lot of concerns around how, the two instruments are going to interact, and there's a duplication of instruments. and all of that. So we went through a process with our Department of Environment to start to understand more of what they understand by carbon budgets. It has been put forward, and our Climate Change Act was recently passed by the President that sets out carbon budgets as one of the tools. It's essentially looking at allocating emission caps at a company level. And there has been some work done on carbon intensity approaches around allocations to companies. From the carbon tax perspective, the key issue for us was around policy stringency. The challenge with the carbon budgets is that it's been implemented over 2 phases. So the first phase was a voluntary phase that started in 2015 and extended for a bit of time, and then now will end in December 2025, with the mandatory phase kicking in from 2026. The key issue there was around policy stringency, and there seemed to be a view around having more business as usual allocations to companies. And from that perspective, we started to view the 2 instruments, the carbon tax as a price and the carbon budgets as 2 separate instruments. But we had to look at options of how we align the instruments. So for the first phase, for the voluntary phase, these carbon budgets required companies to report their emissions so that the department had data to inform the mandatory allocations. So we provided an incentive within the carbon tax to allow companies that submit this data voluntarily to the department to claim an allowance of 5% or a deduction of 5% on their greenhouse gas emissions. For the second phase of the tax, with the mandatory instrument and the carbon tax, we looked at various options, including taxing emissions that exceed the level of the budget that is allocated to the company, and we also considered an option of, if the budget is exceeded, then all emissions should be taxed there. We then agreed on a way forward as part of the parliamentary process. So from the 1st of January 2026, there will be a higher tax rate, carbon tax rate, on emissions above the carbon budget that is allocated to a company. And our view is that this helps us to create a progressive carbon tax system, keep the existing instrument, and then have the higher tax as a punitive measure for non-compliance with the budget.
Okay. There's so much I would like to respond to, but let's not hog time. I'll quickly go to Jubin with a question specifically on the Chinese situation. You mentioned the ETS and the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard, the Green Certificate Scheme, and the domestic crediting mechanism. Also mentioning the indirect emissions being covered in, or intended to be covered in the ETS system. I understand there are some new developments on that, but maybe you can discuss a little bit on the discussions that are currently ongoing in China on how these instruments interact.
Yeah. So the idea of carbon market is you can put the price on the carbon on the emitter side, and then you transfer the cost to the consumer side, and you will let the consumer to choose low carbon product. In power sector, it means you need to have a free power market to do this exchange, to do this trading. But back in 2012, 2013, when China started to develop ETS pilots and national ETS, the power market is still quite highly regulated. So at that time, the climate change department, they think we need to reduce also the electricity consumption, the indirect emission from the consumer side, but we cannot pass through the price. So at that time, the ETS pilots, they cover indirect emission from the consumer side. And so, for example, in Beijing, McDonald's was covered in Beijing ETS. And also some hospital and colleges. That situation changed after several years, so China started a new round of power market reform. And until now, in the whole country, 60% of electricity is exchanged in the market. The price is still regulated, but it's regulated within a range. And in that sense, the power company, they can pass through the carbon costs a little bit. Not entirely, but they can start to do that. So with that consideration, the national ETS, at the very beginning, and the national ETS still cover indirect emission in power sector. So even the power company, they still buy a little power electricity from the grid. So that small part, maybe less than 0.1% of the emission is indirect emission, but it's still covered in the national ETS from 2021 to 2023. And now, when the MEE, they start to expand the China ETS to the industrial sector. And indirect emission is a big part of the industrial sector. And then they realize, oh, now the power market is kind of more liberalized. And there are also other power market policies like all the standards you mentioned, and now even the Chinese government, they will design for one sector, for example, the aluminum, they will decide some percentage of this sector needs to use renewable electricity. So the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, MEE, they figured out it could be the time to separate direct and indirect emission, and ETS focusing on direct emission. So right now, from this year, the indirect emission will not cover in China ETS, not in the power sector, and potentially not in the industrial sector. And also, before this change, there is a CCER, the offset market. So renewable energy used to be the biggest project type in the Chinese offset market, and now in the relaunched offset market, there are two methodologies for renewable energy. One is offshore wind farm, one is photothermal. But the MEE, they released a policy yesterday saying they will coordinate with the National Energy Administration to review this CCER project in 2 years. And first of all, these two authorities, they will say they will coordinate with each other, no overlap issue, green certificate or CCER only one. No overlap, and after 2 years, they will review to see whether they should keep this in the CCER. So that's how the Chinese government coordinates this issue.
Thank you very much. Sorry to cut you short. I would have loved to give you more time to talk about it. It's interesting because I know many countries, developing countries that are looking for implementing ETS are looking to China as an example, and this indirect emissions could have been an option for, on the short term, dealing with a lack of capability to pass through the carbon cost. Maybe very quickly challenging you, Rodrigo, with a question to you before we still go a little bit to the floor. Coming from a multi-country perspective, as you're doing, what do you think, where can countries learn from each other, and also how can international organizations as yourself support that peer learning?
Well, I think conferences like this are absolutely key as we move ahead. What I would suggest that are the key elements of the type of work that we're doing is that there's no one-size-fits-all possible, all-size policy, and that any policy, carbon pricing included, must be assessed in the context of both the broader policy landscape of the country, as well as the specific policies around the carbon pricing. The World Bank had a typology which I think is very useful on policies, which is to what extent policies are overlapping, in what way they interact, overlapping, complementary, or countervailing, and I think that typology is useful to assess policies as we go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being so concise. Let's try and sneak in at least a few questions from the floor. Let's see how much time they give us. If you have a question, can I ask you to give your name, your affiliation, and also if it's addressed to one of the specific panel members to mention it, and otherwise we'll see who wants to pick it up. Stephanie.
Hello, and thank you for the interesting discussion. My name is Stephanie with ICAP, so working with Jibin. A question to all panelists. Carbon pricing affects all of the economy, and it consequently affects all ministries, or most ministries in a government. And many of these other climate policies we're talking about also come from various ministries. What are some of the best practices that you have encountered in supporting this whole of government approach that seems to be necessary to calibrate the policy mix and the role of carbon pricing therein?
Okay, thank you. Let's gather two more if there are others. The gentleman in the back there. So you can think a little bit about your answers.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Norton from VTOL, an energy trading company, and my question is for Shaylin. I read a lot about the South African carbon tax approach being in preparation for CBAM. Is that really part of the objective? And if so, how is it preparing South African exporters for CBAM?
Any other takers? Please, here in the front.
Hi everyone, I'm Philip Voss from the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. I have a question to Rodrigo. You showed some analysis on strategies of different countries. Do you have insights on what's behind that? Like, what's the reasoning why this country took that approach and the other one took another approach? I'm thinking especially on Europe and China, both going into the direction of carbon pricing, and the US, for example, not doing that at all. So if there are insights, that would be interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe let's start with the dedicated questions before we take the one to all panelists. Jolene, did you want to go first?
Thanks very much for the question. So the CBAM is a complicated one for South Africa. The two big sectors is iron and steel and aluminium that will be quite heavily impacted by the CBAM. And you know, the broader approach that the country has taken is to essentially support, you know, these kind of measures being developed under the multilateral process rather than being taken unilaterally. From an economics perspective, we acknowledge the role for these kind of instruments in terms of addressing concerns of carbon leakage. In that context, for the carbon tax in South Africa, we published a discussion paper in 2010, and we acknowledge the role for carbon border adjustments at that time. And we were actually looking at the possibility of developing CBAs at the time for those carbon-intensive sectors, and in particular iron and steel. So when in the context of developing our carbon tax, we were aware of the possibility of these CBAM retaliatory measures. And what we did announce in our budget of 2022 is that we will start to implement higher carbon taxes from 2026. So the carbon tax rate increases from around $10 now to around $16 in 2026 to take into account the CBAM that comes into effect in the EU, and partially because I don't think we can afford to fully align with the pricing of the EU. And this carbon tax, this rate will increase to $30 in 2030. We have also indicated in our budget that we will reconsider some of the tax-free allowances and exemptions under the carbon tax. Specifically, there's an allowance, you know, basic tax-free allowance of 60%, and how that can be reduced over time to strengthen the price signals under the carbon tax. Obviously, this will have to take into account the current state of the economy and where we are at, how our electricity sector transitions, and the implementation of the just energy transition plan, which has received climate finance as part of that change. So yes, in terms of our consideration around the design of the carbon price and our climate policy, we have taken into account the CBAM proposals that are being put forward at the EU, through the EU as well as the UK proposals, and we continue those discussions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Rodrigo, question that was raised to you by Philip?
Well, two questions. First of all, a word of warning on carbon pricing. We talk about carbon pricing as if it were a price, but actually what we're referring to is carbon pricing as a policy instrument. That is an institutional framework or institutional vehicle to implement a price. And I think the distinction is relevant because on the one hand, developing that institutional frameworks is extremely complex, and on the other, there are a number of other carbon prices in the economy. So, for example, the OECD has developed a methodology to identify a carbon price in terms of what is called ECR, the carbon rates across the economy. And I make that distinction because I would argue in the first question, what would be the best practices across different government agencies and so forth, is to take advantage of the carbon price as an institutional framework and actually implement complementary policies around that new framework. So, for example, one could conceive of carbon pricing instruments to develop and improve MRV systems, offsetting systems, and other types of policies that could be implemented all over the economy. So I think it's critical that we understand that these systems that are generated could have a multitude of other implications and important policy instruments. With respect to the second question on strategies, that's a very good question. And I don't have an answer. The policy, the document, it was descriptive. So it identifies that there are these combination of policies in combinations of countries. So I think a research agenda as we move ahead is really to understand what explains this and what the implications are for both policy mixes and for the effectiveness of carbon pricing. Thank you.
Okay. Picked up on Stephanie's question there as well. I think we're about to be kicked out. I don't know if there's anything urgent that Jibin or Charlene you want to say on this question on the best practices.
Yeah, maybe quickly just to say that as part of implementing the carbon tax, we had to coordinate closely with our Department of Environment and Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. We did that through sort of an informal project steering committee, but it helped us a lot in terms of aligning the processes across the three departments in terms of the tax, in terms of the offset system and its design, as well as in terms of the emission reporting system that was finally implemented by our Department of Environment. We've not built on that as yet, but it's something that we probably need to do as we go forward. Thanks.
Yeah, quickly, in China, so President Xi Jinping, he led a small group with all the major ministers that involve climate and energy topic, and this group called Carbon Neutrality and Energy Conservation group, and they have meetings regularly to decide a very fundamental basic question about climate change and energy reform. And when NEE developed the national ETS, they will work very close with industrial sectors and industrial associations to develop the policies and do the public consultation. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, much of this puts the stakeholder effective stakeholder engagement back at the center. So I think that's a good note to close our session. I'm not going to summarize. I'm just going to thank you as an audience for joining us and for posing your questions. Of course, our esteemed panels, please provide them a hand of thank you for being here. And as a last remark, as I mentioned, I'm around here if you want to. I mean, always we would have liked to have more time for discussion, but I will be around if you want to continue or exchange contacts for exchanges afterwards. Also, Samakulo, who's the project officer at PMI, is in the audience, so I'm sure he's also available to, if you want to provide more input to that. So with that, I would wrap up, and thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the days here.